Well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Ryan Aford. I'm an associate professor and graduate chair in the Department of History here at the University of Winnipeg. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Riley Lecture in Canadian History. Can you hear me okay? Good. Welcome to those of you who are here tonight in Convocation Hall at the University of Winnipeg, as well as those of you who are attending online on the Zoom webinar. Just outside the front doors of Wesley Hall, if you were to walk out of Convocation Hall here and look out the windows, you will see two new flagpoles on the front lawn of the University of Winnipeg, and two flags flying beside the flags of Canada and Manitoba. Those are the flags of the Treaty 1 First Nations and the flag of the Métis Nation. So we always acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and now we have a physical representation of that on the front lawn of the campus. The Department of History at the University of Winnipeg acknowledges the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Innu, Dakota, Nakota, Dene, and Métis Nations. We also acknowledge that the water that we depend on is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory, and the power we use is generated in Treaty 5 territory and beyond. Acknowledging the connections between people and places, resources, ideas, institutions, all of these things are important, particularly in the study of history. Tonight's lecture, he is supposed to have with him forged certificates of his freedom and passes, slavery, mobility, and the Creolized counter-knowledge of resistance, helps illustrate that by addressing the history of slavery in Canada, a subject that is still not familiar to many Canadians. Promoting public engagement with the study of Canada's history to as broad an audience as possible is the central mission of the Riley Lecture in Canadian History. The Riley Lecture is sponsored by the Riley Fellowship in Canadian History, which was made possible by a generous gift from H. Sanford Sandy Riley of Winnipeg, an enthusiastic student of Canada's history and a former chancellor of the University of Winnipeg. I want to thank Sandy Riley for his ongoing support of the study of Canadian history in our community. Thanks also to the other members of the Riley Fellowship Committee, current members Janice Thiessen and Eliakim Sabanda, and Mark Mweze, our chair, department chair, and those who've served on the committee this year, Aileen Friesen and Ross McCormick. Special thanks to the indefatigable Sandy Tolman, our department assistant, who does so much to help make these events happen. We definitely do not take for granted the wonderful opportunity that we have each year to invite leading scholars here to the University of Winnipeg to share their research with students, faculty, and the wider community. We extended an invitation to tonight's speaker over a year ago, and we are so pleased that she is able to join us here in person tonight. A year ago, we weren't so sure about that, but it's great that she's able to join us. And it's a great honor for me to be able to introduce Dr. Charmaine A. Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a provost professor of art history in the History of Art and Architecture Department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she is also the founding director of the Slavery North Initiative. Prior to this appointment, she was professor of art history and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at NSCAD University from 2020 to 2022 in Halifax, Canada, where she founded the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. Dr. Nelson has made groundbreaking contributions in the fields of the visual culture of slavery, race and representation, Black Canadian studies, African Canadian art history. Her 7 books include The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America in 2007, Slavery, Geography, and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica, 2016, and Towards an African-Canadian Art History, Art, Memory, and Resistance in 2018. Dr. Nelson has given over 300 lectures, papers, and talks across Canada and the United States, Mexico, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Norway, Spain, the United Kingdom, Central America, and the Caribbean. She is also a regular contributor in the media, including ABC, CBC, CTV, BBC One, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and PBS. She was a Fulbright visiting research chair at UC Santa Barbara in 2010, and the William Lyon Mackenzie King visiting professor in Canadian Studies at Harvard University 2017-18, and Fields of Future Research Fellow at the Bard Graduate Center, New York City in 2021. So for that and many, many more reasons, we are very, very pleased to have her here as our guest to deliver the 2022 Riley Lecture in Canadian History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charmaine A. Nelson.
So thank you all for coming, and I want to give a special thanks to Professors Ryan Aford, Professor Eliakim Sabanda, and Professor Janice Thiessen, for welcoming me and inviting me for this specific lecture. I'm very grateful and honored to be here. And also to Professors Julie Nagam, Kathy Mattis, and Serena Kashafji, as well as Chigbo Arthur and Yanduba for their wonderful welcome as well. All right, so I'll jump in and I'll share the slides as I go ahead, and I'll try to stay put so that the people, if there's people watching on Zoom, they can hear me as well. So I start with a quote. Slaveholders' intervention in the bodily appearance of their slaves could even extend to expectations about gesture, movement, and general demeanor. How slaves reacted when spoken to, how they walked, where they directed their gaze, whether they appeared content. Though he liked being kind to his people, Robert F.W. Alston, a South Carolinian with a great many slaves, declared that he imperatively required of them cheerfulness in their work wherever and whatever it is, end quote. And this slave sale ad from the Quebec Gazette. A Negro wench about 18 years of age who came lately from New York with the Loyalists. She has had the smallpox. The wench has a good character and is exposed to sale only from the owner having no use for her at present. Likewise will be disposed of a handsome bay mare, for particulars inquire of the printer. And that was from 6th of November, 1783. So I'll just mention briefly here too, importantly, it's impossible to do a lecture rigorous and in a critical manner without discussing about slavery, without discussing corporal punishment, psychological, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. So all of you need to be mindful of what you can listen to and how you will then care for yourself as we go about this interaction. So I begin this lecture with two dire and yet sadly commonplace examples of slave owner control. In the first case, we witness how Robert Alston's misperception of his benevolence, his supposed kindness to his people, did not interfere with his belief that his authority rightfully extended not merely to their labor, but their mannerisms and attitudes towards their imposed duties. In the second example, an unnamed white male loyalist who advertised for the sale of an enslaved black woman after fleeing the newly formed United States of America for Quebec was unafraid to state in print that he had forced her to relocate from New York. While the first quote speaks to the slave owner control of the inner worlds of the enslaved, the latter demonstrates their material hold on the outer worlds. If we consider that resistance as behavior or running away in these cases could result in grave punishment or even death, we must acknowledge that transatlantic slavery was sustained by a web of surveillance, physical brutality, and psychological oppression intended to immobilize the enslaved. Two pervasive forms of control exploited the written or printed word to control the mobility of the enslaved: passes and fugitive slave advertisements, also known as runaway slave advertisements. Passes were handwritten or typeset pieces of paper bearing the signatures of enslavers, which describe the limits of the legitimate movements of an enslaved person. Carried on their person, passes were meant to authorize enslaved mobility according to the enslaver's economic and social interests. But their circulation allowed any white person, regardless of slave ownership, to interfere with the daily movements of any black person who they suspected of being enslaved, thus helping to conflate blackness with the legal status of chattel. The second ubiquitous mode of control was harnessed through the technology of the printing press. Mass-produced, widely circulated, and often printed in multiple regions and newspapers simultaneously, enslavers quickly surmised the usefulness of the print culture of slave advertisements to endorse and refine the colonial language of race, which underpinned the systemic exploitation of Black Africans as enslavable. Such ads were produced to facilitate both the exchange, auction, or sale, and the recapture, fugitive or runaway slave ads, of the enslaved. While auction and sale notices were typically brief, they were also profoundly dishonest, given that slave owners were loath to disclose evidence of illness, disability, or resistance. Fugitive notices, however, tended to be longer and more detailed, shedding light on the visual appearance of the enslaved through descriptions of height, age, build, and dress practices like clothing, hairstyles, and adornment. But they also detailed accents, language, ethnicity, birth origins, and the sophisticated tactics of evasion that enslaved people employed to outwit their physically and psychologically abusive enslavers. Although both depended upon the literacy of the producer, whereas passes endorsed and prescribed the mobility of an enslaved person, fugitive notices were literally advertised as illegitimate and illegal the mobility of a freedom seeker who had, according to the law, stolen themselves from their owner, thereby inducing the literate public to participate in the person's recapture and imprisonment through the incentive of monetary rewards and the deterrence of legal threats. So you'll notice that almost all of the ads I'm showing you, the fugitive ones, will promise a reward to someone who turns in the person and threaten that if someone harbors the fugitive, that they will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So the nature, intent, and function of fugitive slave ads sheds considerable light on the issues of knowledge production, circulation, and access for enslaved people, as well as the imposed limits of mobility. The social democratization that accompanied the technological advancement of the printing press was not equally accessible or extended to all. Within transatlantic slavery, enslavers used various strategies of control, employing terror, physical abuse, psychological coercion, controlling access to food, health care, material objects like clothing and shoes, and implementing prohibitions on what they saw as dangerous African cultural practices and knowledge acquisition. However, the issue of language as a vehicle for knowledge transmission within the context of slavery is complex. On the one hand, European enslavers imposed their languages and their place names upon the enslaved, forcing them to speak and understand European languages. While this process must have been an extraordinary source of trauma for the first generations of enslaved African-born people who typically arrived in the Americas with little to no understanding of European languages, the latter generations known as Creoles due to their birth in the Americas, were born into slaving societies where European languages had become dominant. For many of these African Americans, and I mean continental here, their problem was not a lack of European languages, but the gradual transformation or loss of their African ones. Whether or not the enslaved were able to retain their African languages depended on multiple factors beyond their control, like the ratio of African-born people to Creoles. And this chart I'm showing you is based on some research I've done by the 51 fugitive ads that were recuperated from Quebec newspapers in the period of Canadian slavery by the scholar Frank Mackey. So whether or not the enslaved were able to retain their African languages depended on multiple factors beyond their control, like the ratio of African-born people to Creoles, their ability to congregate and practice their cultures without fear or surveillance, and connectedly, their access to leisure time, of which archival sources tell us that the enslaved typically had none. Across various empires, it also became typical for whites to saddle the enslaved with first names, which recalled their European homelands and places of birth. Two striking Canadian examples are the fugitive slave advertisements from Nova Scotia and Quebec for the Black enslaved men called Belfast and Ireland, respectively. And what's really important about this ad is you can tell that Belfast was resisting that name because the slave owner, Michael Wallace, had to concede in the ad that he called himself Bill. Okay? So in this way, European place names and other naming practices became another symbolic mark of ownership and a way to deny the enslaved the ability to control their identities. On the other hand, while it was common to prohibit and restrict African cultural and religious practices, enslavers also almost universally forbid the enslaved from learning to read and write. If knowledge, as the understanding of a shipping timetable, a bill for an impending slave sale, the description of a slave rebellion, or the location of a storehouse of arms was power, then the enslaved were to be summarily blocked from accessing such potential. These strategic attempts to block the enslaved from gaining literacy was a way of controlling Black mobility, and with it, access to the information, ideas, and intellectual transformation that would allow the enslaved to assert their humanity. However, despite these barriers, the perpetual white underestimation of Black intellect and the clandestine practices of Black resistance, as well as prolific white dependence on enslaved Black domestic labor, meant that some Black people came to master European languages, both through speech and through reading and writing. Arguably, enslaved mobility was indelibly linked to intellectual transformation since, for the enslaved Blacks, literacy was an essential component of resistance through flight. Or as Ishmael Reed has put it, quote, "The slave who was the first to learn to read and write was the first to run away," end quote. In what follows, I adopt an extended conception of creolization, and creolization is defined as the transformation of culture, societies, and populations within the context of the contact between Europeans, enslaved Africans, and colonized and enslaved indigenous people in the Americas, to explore the intersection of and conflicts between knowledge production and enslaved mobility. The Western stratification of knowledge was undergirded by a concurrent stratification of mobility and the imperial theft and repurposing of indigenous knowledge in Africa and the Americas. In the early modern period, Europeans did not define volitional mobility as a human right. Or put another way, people that Europeans deemed to be their racial inferiors and sometimes not human at all had no claim to self-directed movement. Rather, one's ability to move about freely in the world without threat of social or physical harm was determined by markers of identity like race, gender, sex, sexuality, and class. Within the context of transatlantic slavery, this meant that elite whites sailed to Africa and the Americas as settlers and tourists. Economically disenfranchised whites, typically those of marginalized ethnic or national origins, sailed as indentured servants, and enslaved black Africans as the inhumanely tight-packed cargoes in the bowels of slave ships with an insurance value on their heads. So it's important here to stress that enslaved people put on the slave ship in Africa, you were not named. You were a man, woman, a boy, or a girl, and you were considered cargo, and you were insured as cargo against losses at sea, meaning if you would die at sea. Okay? So what you're seeing here is an abolitionist use of popular visual culture to push back against slavery, and it's a cross-section of a slave ship, and every black mark is a human being tight-packed into the cargo hold of the ship. What countless Europeans came to see, experience, and document through personal and business journals and printed spreadsheets and ledgers as they sailed along each leg of the globalizing transatlantic enterprise, enslaved blacks would eventually understand only in a piecemeal fashion as they were forcibly disembarked on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and sold to the highest bidder. Therefore, it was not just the experience of the transatlantic transits, which were dramatically unequal, but for the African, access to the knowledge about why, by whom, to where, and for what purpose they were being forcibly removed from Africa. Across the Americas, the enforced and often violent intimacies of slavery propelled the enslaved into close proximity with whites, in whose homes and on whose properties they were forced to live. This enforced contact was amplified in Canada, where the enslaved commonly lived in the same homes or in a lesser building on the same property as their enslavers. While this proximity facilitated surveillance and a violent white drive towards enslaved anti-knowledge, it also created the movement towards what I would like to call a creolized counter-knowledge, a product of individual and collective resistance that was an essential component of Black survival. To the extent that creolization for the enslaved was always experienced under duress, the limits and nature of the knowledge that enslaved Blacks were able to acquire was also a product of their ongoing navigation of the institutional violence of slavery. However, although the widespread evidence of enslaved resistance across temperate, tropical, and semi-tropical regions indicates that such counter-knowledge was commonplace, because its manifestations in things like enslaved literacy was also literally illegal, it is often difficult to recuperate. However, the very fugitive advertisements, which were created through the assertion of white economic, cultural, and technological dominance, due to the determination of the enslavers to recuperate their so-called lost property, and the unrelenting resistance of the enslaved for their freedom, also became frequent sites of the representation of the creolized counter-knowledge of the enslaved Black communities, demonstrating their awareness and analysis of and insights into white behavior, customs, society, and technology. Similarly, to the extent that passes were forged and not just stolen, and networks of counterfeiters emerged to illegally produce documents that usurped the authority of white enslavers, the unauthorized passes used by the enslaved were also a product of this counter-knowledge that was originally intended to defeat enslaved mobility. This counter-knowledge was about the how of enslaved escape, how escapes were actually enacted, which often related to the evidence of the precursory Black surveillance of white individuals and communities, and evidence of sophisticated planning and delayed mobility. In what follows, I will focus on the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Quebec to argue that the knowledge produced in these advertisements was not only deliberately partial and biased, but generative of a violent, even lethal encounters between the freedom-seeking enslaved people and the white population or state-sanctioned agents like jail keepers and sheriffs who hunted them. The language of Canadian ads highlights the extent to which enslavers compelled the reading public to accost and stop Black people. Printed by Hugh Kirkman, a loyalist from South Carolina, the 20th of May, 1783 notice for missing Black youth described as a smart, well-looking Negro boy named Peter, about 17 years of age, informed the public that, quote, if he is stripped, he has his country marks on his back in the form of a square thus. Country marks was a term used by white enslavers to describe African scarification, the self and community-created bodily marks commonly associated with beauty, ethnicity, and rites of passage. Therefore, Kirkham's suggestion that Peter be stripped encouraged the public to manhandle, disrobe, and inspect Peter in order to verify his identity by examining his scarification. I will examine printed and manuscript sources which demonstrate the ways in which white enslavers sought to control the mobility of enslaved and free Blacks in Canada. I will then pursue two biographical case studies for Andrew and Chloe, which will analyze fugitive slave ads that documented the strategies of escape and evasion, or that demonstrate evidence of Black access to literacy. Significantly, given the combination of physical and psychological brutality and material deprivation that was universally imposed upon the enslaved, it is almost impossible to fully recuperate the biographies of enslaved people, except for those few who were fortunate enough to be able to leave published fugitive slave narratives, right? And that's a genre of literature that emerged because enslaved people were able to escape. So instead, we are left with a colonial archive, which, as I've argued elsewhere, was intended to house incomplete entries, their fragmentary nature serving to dehumanize and objectify the enslaved. I begin by defining Canadian slavery, the understudied terrain from which I will draw my case studies. So little is known about Canadian slavery both inside and outside of the nation. However, the small scale of the field of Canadian slavery studies is not a byproduct of an archival deficit, but rather a deep-seated hypocrisy and national amnesia. Canadians are not well trained in a knowledge of the nation's colonial origins and histories under two European empires, Britain and France, at any age of our educations from elementary school to university. Unlike the USA, where one could argue that the average American has a basic understanding of slavery as it transpired in their nation, although admittedly almost exclusively in the South, the average Canadian has no idea that transatlantic slavery transpired in Canada, let alone what it actually looked like. I use the term hypocrisy because Canadians have deliberately used the study and veneration of the Underground Railroad as a 19th century stand-in to obscure or obliterate the two-century participation in slavery, and that is from the 1600s until the 1834. And for those of you of a certain age like me, we grew up on this Heritage Minute, did we not? And the Heritage Minute about Canadian slavery came out in 2022. So instead, they have celebrated, typically during Black History Month, February in Canada and the USA, the 31-year period, that is the Underground Railroad, when enslaved Blacks in the USA fled north across the Canada-US border to freedom due to the earlier abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, of which Canada had remained a loyal part. This celebration of Canadians as abolitionists, however, denies the evidence of the systemic, structural, and informal racism that greeted the fleeing Black people when they arrived, and obscures the histories of the north to south flights of enslaved Black people who ran from Canada to escape their enslavers prior to 1834. In terms of the regional scope of Canadian slavery, it transpired across 6 of the 10 provinces from central Canada eastward, including Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. Now, this doesn't mean that enslaved people weren't brought to Manitoba and West. It means when they were brought there, those regions were not yet provinces. So slavery in Canada became a decidedly urban enterprise. For Quebec, Frank Mackey has determined that enslaved Black people lived primarily in Quebec City, then Montreal, followed by other areas of the province. The labors of enslaved females and males alike were often a mixture of domestic and outdoor duties, frequently described as town and country housework. Since the Canadian climate prohibited an all-year agricultural economy, the tropical plantation model was unsustainable, and connectedly, a smaller population of people was enslaved in the region, making it typical for 1 or 2 people to be held in bondage within the same residence. Indeed, what became normal was white people who simultaneously enslaved Black people and employed indentured servants, often leading to cross-racial collaborations and allyship as both groups fled from their abusive enslavers and employers. And in this case, I'd like to point out that we know that Richard Sutton is white because the ad does not say that he's white. So this is a point in the late 18th century when white enslavers and employers stopped naming whiteness, but earlier in the 18th century, they were naming and describing whiteness. As in other parts of the Americas, white enslavers gave little thought to the separation of Black families and frequently compelled the movement of enslaved people across what later became the Canada-US border. The enslaved Black communities of the regions that would become Canada suffered the direct control, of their mobility by their enslavers. However, the nature of their slave minority status also made daily surveillance from the broader, dominantly white populations pervasive. Since slavery in Canada was a largely urban phenomenon, and Black enslaved people were outnumbered by Indigenous and white populations, enslaved Black people came to be publicly associated with their specific white enslavers. Unauthorized mobility then, especially as escape, would have been perilously difficult to achieve. So central to the proper function of slavery was the ability of enslavers to control the mobility of those they enslaved. This manifested in different ways and at different moments in an enslaved person's life. Transatlantic slavery in its entirety was premised upon the expropriation of millions of Africans, a centuries-long act of terror and brutality spanning 400 years. And the scale of slavery, just to make it clear, scholars now estimate that 4 million people died on the marches to the West African coast before ever being put on a slave ship. 2 million people died at sea, and that's why we call it the Middle Passage, a place of mourning, an unmarked grave of our ancestors. 12.5 million survived to be scattered from Argentina to Canada and the Caribbean, and some forced back to Europe, okay? So the descendants today, who we call ourselves the Black diaspora, are descendants of those 12.5 million people who survived. So, but the ongoing trade and exchange of enslaved people in the Americas meant that they were vulnerable to relocation at the whim of their enslavers. Whites also forced the enslaved to travel through a process of slave rental, through which they profited from the sale of their skills and labor. However, slave rental sometimes allowed the enslaved to evade the surveillance of their slave owners altogether, providing opportunities for escape. There is significant evidence that white enslavers in Canada thought little about the pain and suffering they inflicted upon the enslaved through control of their mobility. Through both legal and illegal means, whites prioritized their own personal and social interests above the basic comfort, dignity, and humanity of those they held in bondage. Black social and familial bonds were not deemed to be relevant in the economic calculations which governed these decisions. As my second opening quote attests, certain cataclysmic events like wars precipitated great upheaval in the lives of the enslaved due to the migrations of their enslavers. During the Revolutionary War, several British colonial officials issued proclamations incentivizing the enslaved to abandon their white revolutionary slaveholders and cross to British lines. However, it is also true that the same men called upon whites loyal to Britain to flee north to Canada, encouraging them to bring their enslaved people and servants with them. This white repopulation began in Nova Scotia prior to the war, when Governor Charles Lawrence offered newly confiscated Indigenous lands to New Englanders willing to move north. This scheme worked, and between 1760 and 1774, an estimated 8,000 New Englanders from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, places familiar with Anglo-American practices of slaveholding, moved north to various parts of Nova Scotia. Furthermore, the scholar Harvey Amani Whitfield contends that Nova Scotia's government offered New England settlers, more land if they brought enslaved people north to the region with them. British colonial officials also used their authority to control the mobility of those they enslaved for personal gain. In the 1780s, John Wentworth, then Surveyor General of the King's Woods in North America, later appointed the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia in 1791, retained 2 enslaved people for himself, Matthew and Susanna, and sent a sizable group of 19 enslaved people from Halifax to Suriname, at the time called Dutch Guiana. As Wentworth described in a correspondence, they were, quote, all American-born or well-seasoned, perfectly stout, healthy, sober, orderly, industrious, and obedient, end quote. In a regretful tone, he then went on to explain that he could not free them and instead wished to be assured of their humane treatment, which he deemed a favor to the purchaser that the purchaser could bestow upon him. Wentworth's description continued to mention their Christianity, skills, health, and potential fertility. And why he's mentioning fertility, of course, is that slavery was organized in a matrilineal order so that any child born to an enslaved female, regardless of the ethnicity, race, or status of the father, was automatically at birth a slave and owned by the person who owned her. So slavery actually was set up and structured to incentivize rape and sexual coercion. So that's why he's mentioning their fertility. So while Wentworth's letter would have helped the enslaver to orient their new so-called property within the configuration of their perhaps unfamiliar tropical labor regime, we are left to wonder about what became of these 19 people in their new lives far away from Matthew and Susanna, who had been left behind in Nova Scotia. The mobility of enslaved people was also controlled through their individual or group sales by common white citizens. Both enslaved and free black men were an essential part of the shipbuilding labor force in Nova Scotia. The skills of black male artisans, abilities which made them both economically valuable and socially vulnerable, were highlighted in a slave sale notice printed in the fall of 1751 in Boston, Massachusetts. The September 30th edition of the Boston Evening Post included a slave sale notice from Benjamin Hollowell, who boasted, quote, just arrived from Halifax and to be stoled, 10 hardy, strong Negro men, mostly tradesmen, such as caulkers, carpenters, sailmakers, and rope makers, end quote. The forced removal of these 10 men from their homes in Halifax would not have included the relocation of loved ones or kin who, if enslaved, would not have had the power to make such decisions for themselves. Furthermore, as was common, since the notice did not insist upon a joint sale, there is a strong possibility that the men were separated and sold to different buyers in Boston or further afield. Their forced alienation from Nova Scotia was most likely exacerbated by a further separation from each other. Black children were not immune from such cross-border sales. On April 29, 1768, a letter written by the founders of the Quebec Gazette newspaper, founded in 1763, William Brown and Thomas Gilmore, detailed their plan to purchase an enslaved child from the 13 colonies. Written to their mentor, William Dunlop, the Postmaster General of Philadelphia, the pair expressed their frustration with a labor retention problem. Since the French-Canadian servants, who they described as intolerable insolent, would not engage for any considerable time, the business duo decided to force the duties of the printing office upon someone who could never leave, an enslaved child. As the letter explained, quote, "We are at last come to a resolution of trying to get a Negro boy, wherefore we beg you will endeavor to purchase one for us," end quote. Disturbingly, the letter reads like an order for a commodity and not a request to purchase and forcibly relocate a human being. They specified that they wanted a boy between 15 and 20 years of age, quote, "fit to put to press, and who has had the smallpox and is country born and can be recommended for his honesty," end quote. While the mention of smallpox demonstrates their interest in the health of the child and his ability to survive the next epidemic, the term country born indicates that they, like Wentworth, were invested in the idea that Black enslaved Creoles were less resistant and more obedient than African-born people. Free Black children, like adults, were also at risk from kidnappers looking to sell them into slavery. Pervasive racism and the conflation of Blacks with the status of slave meant that this fate could befall Black people regardless of their legal status. It is believed that the white Liverpool, Nova Scotia resident, Zebulon Perkins, purchased the employment contract of an indentured Black child from John Stewart in the 1790s. However, a letter from a grand jury to the magistrates of Queens County, reveals that Perkins was accused of deporting the child some 3,008 kilometers away to the Caribbean island of Antigua, where he supposedly sold the remaining time on the contract to a local business owner. Expressing concern for their own business interests and not at all for the grieving Black parents or the doubtlessly terrified Black child, the white citizens on the grand jury framed their arguments for curtailing Perkins' illegal actions in strictly economic and practical terms. In the letter dated the 22nd of April, 1794, James Cox Freeman, writing on behalf of the grand jury, explained that, and I quote, "A transaction of this nature, independent of its illegality, if overlooked, will be productive of much injury to the community," meaning the white community, "in preventing Negroes from binding out their children in the future," end quote. The failure of the grand jury members to mention the names of the Black child or his parents highlights the stark commodification of free Black labor and the utter irrelevance of Black suffering for white Nova Scotians. Perkins's ruthlessness made his declaration about the state and whereabouts of the Black child suspect. Clearly then, if Perkins was heartless enough to seize and deport a free Black child thousands of kilometers away, there was nothing to prevent him from claiming that the child was enslaved and selling him, not his contract, to another person. So on the 3rd of May, 1767, a man named Andrew, described as a mulatto Negro slave, was listed in a fugitive slave ad in the Quebec Gazette. According to James Crofton, a white Montreal vintner, and slave owner who arranged for the notice to be printed, the 23-year-old had been born in Maryland. According to Crofton, Andrew's dress practice included the African tradition of head wrapping, the tying of cloth around the head for warmth, sun protection, sweat absorption, or to disguise lice or other infestations, to style the hair, or as a means of beautification. The ad stated, quote, "He is remarkable for being clean dressed and wearing a handkerchief tied round his head," end quote. Crofton's ad also detailed what he described as Andrew's familiarity with some of the white gentlemen of Quebec City and Montreal, a familiarity brought on, at least in part, by the mobility that Crofton had forced upon Andrew. The notice revealed that in the summer of 1766, Andrew had been rented to a Montreal merchant named Mr. Joseph Howard for 3 months. Further, although Crofton resided in Montreal, his placement of the notice in the Quebec City newspaper, 250 kilometers away, indicates that he relied upon a network of like-minded whites to inform on or even catch Andrew, like the merchant Henry Boone in Quebec City, who he named. Clearly, too, Crofton may have suspected that Andrew had reason to head to Quebec City. Similarly, Crofton's mention of Andrew's Maryland origins was a way to flag for readers that Andrew may have been trying to return to the region from which he had been forcibly removed from community and kin. While Crofton's disclosure of Andrew's Maryland origins may have also been designed to apprise readers of the nature of Andrew's accent, Crofton went further, detailing the languages which Andrew had acquired, stating that he speaks good English, French, a little Dutch, and Ursi. While English and French were commonly spoken in Quebec, Dutch and Ursi were not, and Andrew's knowledge prompts a contemplation of his path of language acquisition through travels and or previous enslavers who had compelled him to learn them, or other communities in which their knowledge proved useful. But Crofton's notice also provided details that indicate that Andrew's escape was not a last-minute or impromptu affair, but meticulously planned. The ad also stated that Andrew, quote, "is supposed to have with him forged certificates of his freedom and passes," end quote. As mentioned above, passes were pieces of paper given to the enslaved by their enslavers to endorse their mobility within certain parameters and for certain reasons. Often authenticated with the enslaver's name and signature, they were meant to be carried by the enslaved person when traveling. As such, the existence and use of the documents established an ideological and social framework that positioned the enslaved as subjects of surveillance to be immobilized within certain regions. The commonality and nature of the passes and their use as evidence of enslaver authority over enslaved immobility meant that other white people understood their ability to demand that any black person who they suspected of being enslaved produce a pass to verify that they had been granted the ability to travel through a certain region. At the same time, the ubiquitous circulation of fugitive slave ads that incentivized white alliances with enslavers with promises of rewards and threats of legal prosecution emboldened whites to know that they could indiscriminately stop, manhandle, search, strip, and incarcerate black people if they suspected them of unauthorized mobility. As I've already mentioned above, one fugitive slave notice stated this expectation explicitly. If correct, Crofton's suspicions that Andrew possessed both certificates of freedom and passes alerts us to at least two potential strategies of escape. Possessing certificates of freedom could indicate that Andrew planned to claim that he had been manumitted, meaning set free, by Crofton, and therefore, as a legally free person, had the right to volitional mobility. But the passes indicate that Andrew, seemingly well known in the two biggest settlements of the province, did not necessarily intend to escape by impersonating a freeman, but instead by embodying his identity as an enslaved man one with the permission of his enslaver to move freely both within the province and across its provincial borders. While the first tactic necessitated that Andrew shed his visible identity as something called a slave and perform freedom in convincing ways, the second one would have allowed him to act out some version of the black male enslaved identity that Crofton and his fellow white citizens expected him to be. It is in that way that Andrew would have escaped detection, not by performing freedom, but by deceiving whites by performing within their diminished expectations of black bondage. Almost a quarter of a century later, another Quebec enslaver named Judah Joseph was hunting an enslaved black woman in print. According to the ad placed on the 28th of July, 1791 in the Quebec Gazette, Chloe was a black woman of about 30 years of age. Unlike Andrew, who was enslaved in Montreal, Chloe's isolation within the slave minority colony of Quebec must have been further exacerbated by Joseph's residence in the small community of Berthier, Quebec. Berthier is situated on the north side of the St. Lawrence River between Montreal and Quebec City, about 80 kilometers northeast from the former and 191 kilometers southwest of the latter. Using typical sexualizing and demeaning language, Joseph described Chloe not as a black woman, but as a Negro wench, the latter term commonly understood to describe a female of demeaned morality and abject sexuality. And this term became a common description of enslaved black females across the Americas as a way to justify sexual predation. So Joseph's notice was extraordinary for the ways that he detailed the how of Chloe's escape, an act which ironically publicly undercut his role as a competent slave owner in several ways. Describing her as a stout and bilingual, English and French, Joseph also explained that Chloe had orchestrated a rather daring nighttime escape on the 13th of July. The ad stated, quote, she got out of a garret window by the help of a ladder, but also that she is supposed to have gone off in a canoe with a man of low stature and dark complexion who speaks English, Dutch, and French. Both disclosures are worthy of close consideration. Since a garret is an attic, typically with a sloping ceiling, Chloe's escape with a ladder through a window informs us that she was likely made to work or reside within Joseph's home, and perhaps even forced to sleep in the attic. If the attic was not where she slept, then we can surmise still that it was a space to which she had access and was not necessarily closely monitored. Chloe's use of a ladder also conveys a sense of the scale of the Joseph residence. Since attics are typically above the upper floor of a house, Chloe's need for a ladder makes sense in terms of the distance she had to move from the attic to the ground when exiting the window. Furthermore, Joseph's description of her as not tall suggests that the distance was too far for her to safely jump. But Chloe's use of the ladder is essential for our understanding of the nature of her escape in another way. Did Joseph learn of how she escaped because Chloe fled so quickly that she failed to remove the ladder after climbing down to freedom? Or once Joseph had determined that Chloe had fled, did he understand that her only way out of his residence was through the window, perhaps because he had incarcerated her in the attic, or because any other path out of his home would have been one by which he would have been alerted to her movements? What seems certain is that Chloe or an ally was able to place the ladder at the appropriate spot of the residence to facilitate her escape, but to do so at a time when Joseph did not immediately detect it. Alternatively, if the ladder could be bundled up like one made of rope, Chloe possibly hid it in the attic undetected until she was able to use it. Was the latter Joseph's property, or that perhaps of the unidentified man in the canoe? It is, of course, impossible to know, but Joseph's choice of words in his disclosure, quote, "She is supposed to have gone off," indicates that he was relating, most likely, not what he himself had seen, but what some informant had later related to him. Therefore, as much as the notice is a testament to how Chloe outsmarted Joseph with a sophisticated planned escape, Joseph's wording also reveals his access to details of Chloe's escape that were not derived from what he directly witnessed. Rather, Joseph's knowledge of the man in the canoe seems to have come from at least one other person and stands as another example of white enslaver networks of knowledge production and circulation designed to stifle the resistance of enslaved people like Chloe. We should also question why Joseph placed his ad in the Quebec Gazette and not the Montreal Gazette or the Montreal Herald, the two other newspapers which were operating in the closer urban settlement. Did he, for some reason, suspect that Chloe's unnamed ally had rowed the pair towards Quebec City, and if so, why? It is also striking to consider what Joseph clearly was unable to discern. His description of Chloe's ally is simultaneously detailed and incredibly lacking. Although we informed that the man in question was trilingual, small in stature, and had a dark complexion, Joseph clearly did not know his age, name, place of residence, or race, things that he almost certainly would have printed to assist in Chloe's recapture. Furthermore, the fugitive notices for white men fleeing from jail, criminals, merchant ships, the sailors, military, the soldiers, and employers, the indentured servants and apprentices, revealed that whites in 18th century Canada used terms like tawny, brown, black, and dark to describe the complexions of other whites. As such, the phrase dark complexion was not a secure race-specific term at this moment in Quebec. The details that Joseph printed ironically worked against the pervasive racial ideology that justified the universal enslavement of Black Africans by describing Chloe's escape in a way that clearly demonstrated her intelligence, forethought, and sophisticated planning that she had employed in her perfectly orchestrated escape from the upper floor of his residence. Although we do not know who aided Chloe, again, because Joseph did not know, she clearly had a male ally who either owned, borrowed, or stole a canoe, and who was willing to risk his own safety to assist her. Joseph's temporal framing of Chloe's escape within one night, the 13th of July, and his claim that she had gone off in a canoe would indicate that the man was waiting for Chloe. Connectedly, although we cannot know how this communication occurred, spoken, written, or with a go-between, this tells us that Chloe must have been able to convey her desire for escape and to confirm her plan with an ally prior to the night of the 13th of July, 1791. Ironically, then, Joseph shared powerful details of Chloe's counter-surveillance of him and his household, the knowledge of which allowed her to escape. So transatlantic slavery was unique in its horror because it defined the slave as a thing. Chattel under the law or movable personal property, enslaved people suffered physical brutality, terror, material deprivation, and domestic and community surveillance designed to indoctrinate them into a belief in their supposed racial inferiority. By instilling the idea of inferiority in the slave community, enslavers hoped to elicit self and community policing. To be a slave meant that you had no control over yourself, your life, and that of your community and kin. Enslavers controlled every aspect of the lives of the enslaved, of the people they held in bondage, including the nature, location, and duration of their labor, their diet, their clothing, their language, and their cultural practices. The imposition of a matrilineal order meant that enslavers also owned at birth any children born to their enslaved females, regardless of the race or social status of the child's father. As I've discussed throughout, another thing over which enslavers exerted jealous, often violent control was the mobility of the enslaved. Since slavery had a fundamental economic imperative, dictating where an enslaved person was, why they were there, and when they would return was a means of controlling their labor and its monetary rewards, which enslavers unilaterally stole. But the desire of enslavers to control the movements of the enslaved also demonstrates their pervasive fear of enslaved resistance as flight. As the fugitive slave ad placed for Andrew and Chloe demonstrate, enslavers had reason to be afraid. Both of these fugitive notices revealed the Creolized counter-knowledge of the enslaved in Quebec. Therefore, in spite of the clear evidence of the devastating abuse of enslaved and free Black people by white enslavers and employers in Canada through the strategic control of their mobility, undoubtedly there is also indisputable evidence of Black free and enslaved people building networks, calling upon allies, and using their intelligence, skills, talent, ingenuity, and perseverance to outmaneuver their oppressors. Thank you. Sure. Explain the questions?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So, thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. And I believe that Dr. Nelson has agreed to answer some questions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to grab that mic over there, and I'm going to walk around to you as you put your hands up. And there may also be some questions from the Zoom audience, and we will also, we'll pay attention to those as well. So,
Sounds great.
I'll step out of
Thank
the
you,
way.
Professor.
Questions?
And please don't be shy, because I realize that most of us in Canada, again, have not had the opportunity to study Canadian slavery. I myself have never taken a class on slavery, transatlantic or Canadian. I had to teach myself how to do this work. So there is no stupid question, really. Anything, we need to discuss it all, okay?
With that, maybe just I want to ask how you first started to study the subject. Like when you said you hadn't introduced.
Teach myself, yeah.
Yeah, so do you want to speak to
Sure.
that a bit? Yeah.
Sure, thank you. So how I came to study transatlantic slavery and Canadian slavery was that for my master's, which I did in art history at Concordia, I started off doing research on 20th century Canadian painters who were depicting representations of portraits and nudes, or what we call in art history nakeds, of Black women. But this artwork was around 1930s to 50s. But then I moved further back in time with my PhD. I looked at a 19th century American sculpture in the moment of the Civil War. So it kept occurring to me, listen, I cannot possibly analyze and understand and dissect and interrogate these sculptures without understanding what slavery was, because the majority of the subjects I was looking at in neoclassical sculpture were enslaved Black men and women. So I realized that to do justice to that art historical analysis, I had to understand what slavery was. And then as my career has progressed, actually, I've kept moving back into time. So now you can see I'm in the 18th century and back in Canada and Jamaica. So again, I had to figure out, okay, now I figure out what American slavery was, and I studied Jamaican slavery, but what was Canadian slavery? And as you can tell from a lot of what I said, there's major distinctions, not in terms of treatment necessarily, but in terms of what community looked like, in terms of population size, in terms of labor, when you move across different regions between tropical and semi-tropical slavery, which was often plantation slavery, monocrop agriculture, where a planter is growing one crop, only cotton, only rice, only tobacco, coffee, sugarcane. And then when you get to the American North or Argentina or Canada, you're doing everything your enslaver wanted as an enslaved person. Sometimes agricultural labor, pick the apples, grow the corn, milk the cow, then get in the house, churn the butter, diaper my child, all of it. So there's no division in the way of plantation slavery between the domestic enslaved person and the field, so-called field slave in those regions. So I had to, because of the art I was looking at, Professor Afert, I had to go back and learn that context to be able to understand how those enslaved Black people were being represented. Yeah.
Thank you. Here's a question from Professor Kachevji.
I did not have a question, but I really like the way that you've contextualized art history here. So here you had these, sculptures, and then you went backwards to try and figure out the entire context of them. And now I'm wondering about, are you able to do an exhibition? Or what are the visual elements of what you're doing right now? I know at the beginning you did show us some implements and things like that.
Yes, yes.
So is there a visual part to this that continues the art history tradition?
Sure. So the first show I ever did was called Through Another's Eyes. That was at the Robert McLaughlin in Oshawa, and it traveled to 4 different venues. And I went from this quite famous portrait of an enslaved woman that was known historically as Negress or Portrait of a Negro Slave. It's owned by the McCord in Montreal, and that was created by Francois Malpart de Beaucourt, he's often lauded as Canada's first professional artist because he left the country, he left Quebec to go and train in Bordeaux, France. But in any respect, that painting was in the show, and that dated 1786. And then the show went right up to 1998 with works by Joanne Todd. So that was the first time I tried to assemble and narrate what was going on with white artists' preoccupation, and there was a decided preoccupation amongst white Canadian artists with Black female subjects. Since then, I haven't curated so much as often I lend my voice to other people's exhibitions. So for instance, there's a show going up now called The Color of Anxiety on neoclassical sculpture in Britain. And they asked me to write, to revisit my work on neoclassical sculpture and slave subjects to talk about something that's really interesting in that work. Neoclassical sculpture, if you've ever seen it, is characterized by white marble, always white marble. And neoclassicists in the 19th century were actually antagonistic to polychrome sculpture, so people who used different colors of material or people who tinted the marble. And they thought that was garish, and they thought that was not art, to do that quite frankly, that art was about form, not color. But in my work, I also decoded, of course, when you go back and read what they were saying to each other in their discussions and their discourse, that was also about race and about a fear of Blackness and a suppression of Blackness at the level of complexion. So I've contributed that essay to that forthcoming exhibition. But thankfully, there is, I should point out, a field of us scholars, mainly art historians, who work within a subfield of transatlantic slavery studies that's dominated obviously by historians. And that subfield is called the visual culture of slavery. And that's mainly art historians like myself who look at, so think about it, slavery was 400 years. All the empires, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Denmark often get forgotten, right? Okay, they were also producing across the 400 years art and visual culture about slavery, often expressly or explicitly pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And then on top of that, the African peoples and their descendants were also producing art across the 400 years. So the people best positioned, here's a shout out for art history, to actually do that analysis are art historians. And sadly though, we're last to the table often in terms of the field of transatlantic slavery studies. So I'd like to encourage any students out there who are interested in doing this work. There's a lot to be done, a lot to be done.
All right, we have a question here from Adele Perry from University of Manitoba.
Thank you for that really rich and super sharp talk. I guess I was thinking a little just about the particular archive of colonial newspapers, which I wanted, it's a really prosaic question, but I mean, I'm struck by their visual kind of politics, and also by their obvious politics, and I just wondered if you wanted to sort of maybe talk a little bit about them as a particular kind of source for this kind of work.
Thank you, Adele. Thank you so much. Okay. So first, what we have to understand, especially in our age of social media, right? This media was slow back then, meaning what? The Quebec Gazette and the Montreal Gazette were printed weekly, right? So you're waiting every week, Tuesday, for instance, for your newspaper to come out. The size of the papers were typically 3 to 4 pages long. What's interesting is the slave sale or fugitive slave ads did not always appear on the same page. So when I'm doing the research, as you can imagine, because I'm interested too in the duration that someone was able to stay at large, when I find an ad, a fugitive ad, I go to the next issue and the next issue and the next issue and try to discern when the ad stopped running. Then I get a sense of for how long the person was at large. It doesn't prove when the ad stops the person was caught, because the owner might have given up and said, this is a waste of my money, I'm never going to catch this person, right? But that said, what characterized the ads, I don't know if any of I showed you, did you see a little icon in the corner of any of them? Okay, check this out. Okay, in the United States of America, the icons evolve into 2 specific gendered things. The black enslaved male in profile as if he's running, frozen in the motion of running, and the enslaved female sitting with a bundle as if she's resting. And you almost never see those in the ads I've seen in Quebec and Nova Scotia. And what you see instead are these really indigenous-looking figures. And I think what's happening in Quebec, of course, is that the largest population of enslaved people in transatlantic slavery in Quebec were indigenous, and the black population was smaller than the indigenous population. So I think what's happening there, too, is if you trace the iconography of that indigenous-looking or indigenized figure, is that it comes from 16th and 17th century tobacco advertising. So there's all these different kind of conflations going on in terms of blackness and indigenousness, and in the context of, let's say, the Quebec newspapers. And in the Nova Scotia papers, I found very few, I think, or I can't even recall any of them necessarily. I think one I found has an icon at all. So it'll be interesting once we start to collect these ads across all of these provinces, again, Ontario to Newfoundland, what that iconography looks like, because definitely in south of the border, it becomes reified rather quickly. Thanks. Can I just point out one more thing, Adele, that's great about your question? These enslaved people are escaping in a world of fugitives. So when you read these newspapers, white men are fleeing from the military. White men are fleeing from merchant ships. So every time a merchant ship docks in a place like Montreal, the captain loses a portion of his crew. So they're printing desertion ads too. Then people of all races who are apprentices and indentured servants are fleeing from their abusive employers. And then enslaved people are fleeing from their enslavers. And wives are fleeing from their abusive husbands. And what's so interesting, there's a lot of parallels across these different types of ads. But the fugitive wife ads are very interesting because typically the man or the husband printing the ad is not saying, help me get her back. He's actually often saying, do not give her credit in the store in my name. Don't let her buy anything from you and charge it to my name, right? So they're very interesting, whereas the other ads are characterized by, help me get this person back, and to boot, they call upon the military and the sheriffs and jail keepers to help them recapture and reincarcerate these people, and they explicitly name jails and workhouses. Thank you, Adele.
Oh, right on cue. Okay, so we had one question here, then one here. Okay, so we've this. Okay, we'll pass it over here. We'll just get you to introduce yourself when you ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. My name is Justin Tata. Yeah, I really like how you expose the strategies that Canada used to conceal their role in extracting the slave labor, or extracting this, their role in participating in slavery.
Right.
I wanted to ask if you can help me. What about in our century today, the role that Canada plays in extraction of resources around the world? Has the strategy changed, or it's similar, or are there differences or similarities with the strategies used during the slavery?
Colonialism today, wow, that's a great question. So First, I'll say I'm not an expert in contemporary politics or history, but I know what you're gesturing to, of course, is continuing what many people call continuing colonialism. They don't even necessarily call it neocolonialism. So I think the biggest distinction would be that when you look at the period of slavery, you're dealing with individuals and then the slow rise of corporations like insurance companies and bankers that start to underwrite slavery through things like insurance. Like I mentioned on the slave ship, enslaved captives were considered a cargo. So when you look, for instance, in the Anglophone world, some of the biggest and wealthiest British insurance companies and banks started off by underwriting slavery. So some of what's going on today, it's those same companies going forward doing similar things in other regions and moving. I think this is a key thing too. Today, you have corporates that have, they're really nimble in their mobility in terms of picking up and moving their enterprises or sourcing labor from places that have non-existent or less strict labor laws in order to exploit not just material resources, but employees on the ground. The difference, I think, in the period of transatlantic slavery, that I think for many of us today who see it obviously as so egregious, is that it was all legal. So nobody had to hide. So when people, often ask me when I talk about Canadian slavery, they say, how do you deal with the deficit in the archive? There's no deficit in the archive. People historically who practiced slavery were not embarrassed to own other human beings. They wrote everything down. The deficit occurs with trying to recuperate enslaved biography. Because as I said, strategically how enslavers documented the enslaved was in a piecemeal fashion, literally as livestock. And that's how they talked about our ancestors, as livestock. So that's, I think, one of the major distinctions, is that nobody was hiding between the 1400s and the 1800s because it was all legal. And so the strategies in terms of where you did your slaving had more to do with where do I want to live and how do I make my money. And what you saw, though, there was mobility there too, though, because there was a huge phenomenon of many European enslavers who owned plantations in the Caribbean who never set foot in the Caribbean. And they called themselves, or they were called absentee planters. So they relied on white men on the ground to be the overseers and the lawyers on their properties, and correspondence going back and forth about what was happening with their hundreds of enslaved people. But whether in England, for the most part, or Britain, or back in a place like Jamaica, it was all legal what they were doing. So they didn't have to hide any of that correspondence or any of that, the material documentation of their enterprises then, if you will. Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah.
A question over here from Professor Sabanda.
Well, I think I'll just ask a question.
Sure.
Charmaine, since she's checking over there.
Sure.
Your presentation about not doing slavery here in Canada made me feel like privileged, because where we come from, we do slavery in all these countries, from primary school throughout secondary school. But I have a question there.
Mm-hmm.
The conventional talk about the Underground Rail. I think
About
the
the what,
president,
sorry?
The Underground Rail.
Underground Railroad,
right.
yes.
And did the slaves indeed run to freedom, as the narrative has it, that they came to Canada to be free, and they were Nova Scotia, and did they come to freedom?
Yes, so it is true that thousands of, okay, so to be very specific, many would have been African-American enslaved people, meaning born in what became the United States of America, and others were African-born, okay? So many, thousands fled to Canada, mainly up into Ontario, what today is southwestern Ontario, but also into parts of Quebec and elsewhere, and were aided by Black and white and Indigenous people who hid them, who harbored them, who fed them, who clothed them, and who helped to lead them, and formerly enslaved people like Harriet Tubman, who was very famous in Canada, and ended up living, after being a conductor on the railroad, that's what the people who led the people out of slavery were called, and living out the rest of her life in St. Catharines, Ontario. Now, My beef is that when you do this research, you see very clearly that prior, okay, the Underground Railroad, 1834 to 1865, okay? When Britain abolished slavery, August 1st, 1834 to 1865, the end of the American Civil War. Prior to 1834, what you find in the archive through things like fugitive slave ads are that enslaved people, black people in Canada are fleeing south. Knowing that they cross a border, they might be in a slave state, they don't care. The objective there is get away from your enslaver. So prior to 1834, the Canada-US border, what becomes the Canada-US border, enslaved people are running back and forth across that border just to get away from their enslaver. Nobody in Canada wants to talk about that, right? Supposedly we were land of the free, it never happened here. The other part of that hypocrisy is the Underground Railroad was 31 years. Transatlantic slavery in Canada under the French and the British was 200 years. And again, there's no research or archival void that prohibits us from doing the histories on that 2-century period. What's missing is the will. And for instance, what's missing, you know, I've talked to many of you as you were hosting me across these last few days. I am one of, I believe, 5 professors in Canada now. I'm in the USA. So the people I know around the world who work on transatlantic slavery, there's 5 of us, now 4, because James Walker at Waterloo just retired, who routinely research and teach Canadian slavery. So in Canada, you're more likely to find a professor employed at a Canadian university who teaches about the American South, Brazil, the Caribbean, and doesn't know anything about Canada. Right? And then I'm the one, well, now the second art historian who does that, because I was telling many of you, I gave birth to myself after 20 years. And what I mean by that is the new hire, Professor Joanna Joachim at Concordia in art history and art education was my MA and PhD student. That took 20 years. Why do I have to do, like, where's anybody else helping with this? Right? So now she does research on New France and New Orleans and Haiti. Right? So she has that knowledge of Canada through her work on New France. And I work on Nova Scotia and Quebec, of course. And then there's Afua Cooper and Dalhousie and Harvey Amani Whitfield, who I mentioned at Calgary. Like, how many students can each of us supervise in a 30-year career if we're that blessed? Right? So this is the tragedy of the slow speed of the growth of Canadian slavery study, because a lot of it's dependent on getting the wonderful grad students to come and work with us to do the MA or the PhD and stay in the field, right? Some of these people like Joanna have to stay in the field and then have their own grad students. So can I just say that is why, plug for Slavery North, we need to have institutes like this, because my institute then, that was the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery at NASCAD, I took it with me to UMass. Now it's Slavery North. Why? Because we're going to focus on Canadian slavery still and slavery in the American North, another huge blind spot. Most Americans have no clue that slavery happened in Pennsylvania, New York State, Massachusetts, et cetera. But the template of and the vision of my institute is to just hand money over to the scholars, right? Where's the MA student doing the thesis on New Brunswick slavery? Where's a PhD student working on, you know, a PhD dissertation on slavery and PEI? Here's some money, go do your work, right? And the artists in residence, because let's face it, the average person, human being, how they learn about slavery, they will watch 12 Years a Slave and Django Unchained before they'll ever come to this lecture. It's right. If we don't have the artists doing this work, we're never going to reach a lot of people. So where are the filmmakers? Where's the playwright? Where's the painter? And there's a lot of people doing this work, right? But where's the money for them to be able to do this work? They need that support. So my model is the fellowships are the traditional scholars, and hopefully one day postdocs too, who's the professor who wants to have a sabbatical, come and spend time with us at UMass. But also the artists in residence are essential to expanding the field, right? Because there's only so much, all of you wonderful professors know, only so many people you can supervise in a lifetime, right? And this field is very important, very powerful. You can tell by the stuff I'm talking about. But listen, these ads I'm showing you, at the present, they're barely starting to go into databases, and transatlantic slavery studies is at the leading edge of digital humanities. But if you go onto these digital humanities platforms about slavery, almost all the content is about the tropics. So if you're researching Jamaica, you can stay at home in your pajamas. You never have to go to a library and archive and deal with microfilm because it's all already online for the most part, right? If you're working on PEI, if you're working on New Brunswick, you have to go deal with microfilm in the provincial archives in Fredericton. You get me? Yes, thank you. You got to change that, right? We have to change that so it makes it easier for all these scholars who actually want to do the work, right? So that Quebec ads you saw there, I had a shirt grant and I paid an RA, brilliant RA, I'm going to say her name because that was a lot of work, Victoria Lessard, and I said, go and digitize all these ads that Frank Mackey found and transcribed because I, as an art historian, want to see it, to Dell's point, I want to see the ad. I want to see if there's an icon. I want to see what it looks like. And I want to see how many times it was printed. So I was able to pay her through that grant to do all that work. That was a lot of work. That took her like 2 years, right? But we got to do that for every province from Ontario east, right? So there's a lot of work to be done.
That seems to me like a good place to wrap up for this evening and give you a chance to talk to all these students here.
Yes, students.
So you can recruit them,
them.
to come down to work for your institute.
UMass Amherst has money for all of you. Seriously, I'm not joking, yeah.
So with that, I'll ask all of you here and all of you on Zoom to please join me once again in thanking Dr. Charmaine A. Nelson.
Thank you.